Brad came by the other morning with his cap in his hand, pacing like he had news to tell but couldn't quite find the first word of it. When he finally sat down, he said, "Uncle Ernest, I found something that makes sense of my whole childhood." He said it serious, too, like it rattled something loose inside him. Then he told me the term, the way the man tells you the name of a new star he just found through a telescope. Tethered Nomadism. Well, I had to laugh. I said, "Brad, son, I don't know what book you're reading, but that right there is just going to camp." And he grinned because he knew I was half right. But he kept on, explaining that it meant a life tied to one home place but lived in circles, moving out to familiar spots year after year, season after season, without ever drifting too far from the hearth. When he laid it out that way, I leaned back and said, "Well, I'll be. We really have been living that word our whole lives without knowing it." Because the way we grew up around Fountain Creek and the Pennington farm wasn't wandering, it was circling. It was a rhythm tied to land and season, as dependable as the saline river swelling in the spring or the first squirrels getting reckless in early fall. When I think of Brad as a little thing, I don't picture him inside that house much at all. I picture him slipping across foot logs, moving through the back fields, watching cows to see which pasture they'd migrated to overnight. And always, there was a camp somewhere waiting. In the spring, it was the fishing camp down toward Longview. Now, people who didn't grow up here always want to put willows into the story, but that's not our river. The banks of the Saline don't hold willows. They hold water tupelo with those big bell-bottom bases, water elms stretching crooked over the current, hackberry with warty bark like old scars, sycamores shining white in streaks where the bark peeled, and overcup oak lifting up from the flats. If you saw cypress, it meant the water got still, a back pocket, a slow eddy, or a slide-off slough where turtles sunned on logs. And underneath it all, palmetto crowding the lower banks like a little green army. That's the real picture. That fishing camp wasn't fancy. Nobody's camp was. It was a couple of boards nailed into something that wanted to lean, a fire pit that always smelled a little like last weekend's catfish grease, and a view of a river that changed moods quicker than a raccoon. But to us, it was the spring station on the circuit, the place we went when the red buds lit up and the air carried that soft smell of water warming back to life. Then came the squirrel camp. Early fall, the mornings crisp but not cold, and the woods up in the upper timberlands just humming. Now let me tell you about those timberlands. You couldn't ask for a prettier mix of loblolly pine, post oak, black gum, and a scattering of cherry bark oak rising toward the sky. That high ground above Fountain Creek was a world of its own, sandier underfoot, drier, cleaner lines between the trees. When Brad got old enough to climb a tree, that's where he went. He'd find himself a persimmon tree, ripe late in the deer season when the air smelled like cold iron, and he'd climb up where he could watch the whole pasture like a lookout. Then there was deer camp, sometimes down toward Slim Slough, sometimes up higher, depending on where folks had seen sign. The river might give you tracks overnight if it fell a few inches, or the timberlands might give you a good trail cutting between oaks dropping acorns. Either way, there was always a camp. And every camp had a history, usually told in half-truths by men sitting around a fire, exaggerating distances and deer sizes until the night got thick with it. You see the point yet? One house, many camps. One home place, a dozen orbiting outposts. That's tethered nomadism. Not the fancy kind that ends up in academic journals, but the lived version, the one that grows out of habit and necessity and pleasure all wrapped together. And here's the part that feels good. Brad didn't just see the word and think it was clever. He saw how it connected his life to everybody else's around here. Not just family, but neighbors, friends, even the old-timers he only knows from stories. Because in Ashley County, nearly every family had at least one little place they called a camp. Folks would say, "We're going down this weekend," and you didn't have to ask where. Everybody had a picture in their mind. But that pattern didn't end with us. When he told me about tethered nomadism, the first thing I thought of was the Crosset Company camps. Back in the early days, the mill might be in town, but the real work, the cutting, the hauling, the rail spurs snaking into the timber, that happened in little camps all over the woods. Men kept their houses in Crosset or Hamburg, but they lived half their lives out in the timber, tied to home by a long string, but always out there somewhere following the work. And that too is the same pattern, the tether and the circuit. Now, part 2 will take this even deeper because Brad didn't stop with the company camps. He kept reading, and what he found tied our way of life to people who lived here thousands of years before we were born. But that's his story to tee up and mine to finish tomorrow. He kept on digging through his books and notes the way a coon dog's a scent. And when he came back the next day, he said, "Uncle Ernest, this thing goes way deeper than Crosset or Fountain Creek. This goes back thousands of years." Well, that got my attention. I set my coffee down and said, "All right, son, tell me what you found." And he started reading from that file he'd put into his AI gizmo, something about the Toms Brook Riverine people living around here 7,000 years ago, back when the land was young and the rivers weren't boxed in by these modern boundaries. When he talked about how they lived, I felt the hair on my arms prick up, because it wasn't foreign at all. It wasn't strange. It was familiar as the smell of a wood stove in November. He said these Toms Brook people had one main home place, a hub, usually up just high enough to stay dry, but close enough to the river to hear it talking. And from that hub, they made seasonal circuits. Spring, fish camps on the river edge. Summer, gathering camps in the upland pockets. Fall, hunting camps on the ridges where the deer crossed. Winter, sheltered camps where the wind couldn't find them. The archaeologists made it sound new, but I swear they could have come to our family reunions and heard the same thing from men leaning on truck beds. And I told Brad, "Son, what you're describing ain't the past. That's the blueprint we've all been following without knowing it." Because think about it. Those ancient folks didn't wander. They moved in a pattern. They knew the land intimately, where the water would slip its banks, where the roots of a tupelo held the shore firm, where the overcup oak flats would stay wet even in a drought. They didn't have maps, but they carried a map inside them, made of memory and experience. That's the same map Brad carried as a boy, walking the saline edges and learning the difference between willow elms stretching low over the bank, sycamores shining like bone in the sun, tupelo throwing shadows into dark water, hackberry leaning at odd angles, and cypress knees poking up where the river slowed. Not a willow in sight, because that's not who we are here. That's not our river's language. And when Brad talked about these people, these ancestors in the widest sense, I felt something settle in me, a kind of understanding. See, down here in Ashley County, we've always been close to modern things. We had mills, trains, steam engines, industry, but beneath all that, there's an older rhythm that didn't get erased. It just got folded into new shapes. Take the Crosset Company camps, for example. The early crews lived out in the timber for weeks at a time. They leave the home place in town and move to whatever camp the logging line reached that month. Men lived in bunkhouses, ate beans and salt pork, sharpened their saws by lantern light, and knew the woods deeply, not because they were trying to reenact anything, but because the land required it. Those men were the modern face of an ancient pattern, and Brad was right. When he heard it explained as tethered nomadism, it hit me that we weren't doing something quaint or old-fashioned. We were participating in a 7,000-year-old continuity of how humans live along rivers that rise and fall, soils that shift, forests that breathe in cycles. Now, of course, the world's different today. Land's expensive, gas will make you think twice. You can't just go set up a deer camp on somebody's back 40 unless you want to get a stern talking to or worse. And folks stay indoors too much, if you ask me. Their hands don't know bark or silt or the feel of a morning cold enough to sting your teeth. But as I sat there listening to Brad explain it, I realized something. People still want it.
Folks are starving for camps, even if they don't say it that way. They want a place where the phone don't matter, where the only schedule is daylight, where the land teaches you something that can't be typed or streamed or scrolled. And maybe that's why this whole thing stirred me up, because even if we can't live it exactly the way our people did, the pattern is still there waiting to be picked up. It's as old as the river and as natural as a squirrel trail cutting through the pines. I told Brad, son, this ain't just a memory. It's a heritage of motion, and we're losing it, but we don't have to lose all of it. And he nodded because he knows. He felt the same pull I did. Maybe he felt it stronger because he's out there writing and digging and trying to name things the world forgot to name. And I said, maybe going back to camp every now and then is enough. Maybe you don't have to rebuild the whole pattern. Maybe you just touch it, keep that tether warm, and that's enough to keep a man from drifting too far from himself. The truth is, Brad helped me understand something I'd felt all my life but never put into words. The land teaches you in circles, not in straight lines. You go out, you come back. You return to the same places, and they change with you. And one day, you realize that the land has been raising you just as much as your folks did. So I told him, write it down, Brad. Tell people what this life really was. Don't let it slip away without giving it a name, because our people weren't wanderers, they were tethered travelers, moving through a world that expected them to know it well. And he smiled because he knew that's exactly what he'd been trying to do all along.